like I said, we just went through buying our first home. Lauren and her husband are getting ready to buy their second home. So, I think we can kind of attest that the home buying process, especially if it's your first time, it could definitely be like an overwhelming experience. I mean, there's finding the right agent, and then of course finding the right home, and then there's tons and tons of documents that you have to sign and submit to all the various parties. So there's definitely some room for confusion, for things to go wrong. And so I guess like where I'd really love to start off today is, what would you say are maybe some of the biggest, I don't know, mistakes or misconceptions that people have when they're getting into the home buying process for the first time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest mistake is either number one, thinking that you can't buy a house, so just like waiting, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, but there is this huge misconception that you need a massive down payment, and that's not always the case. It's kind of up to you how much you want to put down. So yeah, just waiting so long, and on to that note, like waiting until the perfect house comes up on Zillow to get started, because usually that's too late. So really being intentional and getting prepared before you're actually ready to start looking will really set you up for success.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, when we're talking about like the financial side of things, like from your experience, how can someone evaluate when they're ready to financially buy a home? Like, how should they know that they're ready to take this next step?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to this, but I would say number one, income. That's the biggest thing that lenders are going to look at. So do you feel really solid in your income? Do you have consistent income? The second thing is saving. So again, you don't need to necessarily have a huge down payment, but are you able to set aside money every month? Because again, even if you're not putting a ton down, that's going to set you up for success as a homeowner, because repairs and maintenance will come up and you want to make sure that you are able to put aside a little bit every month. And then of course, credit. So you don't need to have an 820 credit score, the higher the better, but you do want to have, a decent credit score, at least 650 and above. You can go down below 600, 580 in some circumstances, but you really want your credit to be in good standing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I've said this so many times on this podcast, but my financial journey started when I was like thinking about buying a home. This was probably back in like 2018. And I didn't have like any money in savings, like very, very little. Like it was like my tiny emergency fund, and I was trying to buy a house. And so I felt really bad about it. And then I Googled like, is this a good idea? And got like a resounding like, no, you should probably not buy a house at this point. So totally understand what you mean. Like, don't have to have a huge down payment, but maybe you should be having some savings on the side there. So I guess following up to that question then, how does someone, like if you mentioned that all of your friends coming out of college, like they don't know how to buy a home. How do they even know what they can afford? Like, how do you help someone determine their price range?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you are like, okay, I want to buy a house in the next 3 months, you need to talk to a lender so they can tell you exactly what your financial situation is and exactly what your price point is. But if you're just kind of getting started and curious, I would sit down and really think about what monthly payment you would really be comfortable with paying for the next 5 to 10 years. Doesn't mean you need to keep the house 5 to 10 years, but what are you really okay with paying every month for the mortgage in the long term? And then looking at an online mortgage calculator, there's a ton out there to see how much you have saved and can use for a down payment, what that matches to in a monthly payment and in a purchase price.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like sometimes, maybe your experience as well, but sometimes, if you don't sit down and look at the numbers yourself and you go to like the lenders, they'll tell you this pretty large amount that you might not be able to feel comfortable with paying that monthly payment on. So yeah, I think you're spot on there. Like, breaking that down and making sure that you feel comfortable with the monthly payment, because we know it's not always about the monthly payment. There's a ton of hidden costs in there. So do you want to jump into like what you see and what people should consider as they're looking at like what they can afford monthly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest thing that comes up that first-time homebuyers aren't expecting is maintenance. So you want to make sure that you can afford around 1% of the purchase price in home maintenance. And that's going to vary depending on, where you're at and what home prices are in your area. So if you're looking at $1 million house, you're probably not going to spend $100,000 in home maintenance, but if you're looking at a $400,000 house, you can expect to spend $4,000 a year in maintenance. So make sure that you can afford that. In your mortgage, it will include the property taxes and insurance, but those can increase. They probably will increase at least a little bit as your home value increases. So make sure you can build in a little bit of buffer room for that.
Yeah, I love that. Lauren, what you had mentioned about the lenders approving you and what you can actually afford. Like, I was so shocked to see that we got approved for like five in mid 500s, but we felt comfortable buying it at a price that was around 380. We got in at 380, but we were comfortable looking at around 400. And it's wild to see, like what you said, what they can approve you for, and then what you feel like you can actually afford. But Stacey, I know you've posted about this like on your Instagram, which for anyone who's listening, Stacey has an amazing Instagram with tons of tips on the home buying process for first time buyers. But how can someone kind of gauge, and you had kind of mentioned this, how can they gauge like what isn't an amount that they feel like they can afford on a monthly basis?
Yeah, I mean, so there's the 28-36 rule that says that you should spend no more than 28% of your gross income on a mortgage payment. That is a great starting place. Lenders will approve you for up to 45% and sometimes even more of your gross income, which is why it sounds really high. For a lot of people, that's more than their take-home pay. So somewhere in between that, like between 28% to 43%. And I tell people to practice making that mortgage. And this is actually a tip that one of my mentors at the mortgage company gave me. So if you're paying $2,000 a month in rent and you're looking at a mortgage payment of $3,000 a month, spend 3 months paying an extra $1,000 every month. Put that money aside into a separate account so that you don't have that for the rest of the month, and see how that feels. And then that will really show you, like, can I afford this, or do I need to adjust this payment?
The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.